All right, we are going to get started. It's 1 o'clock. So I want to welcome all of you to the panel about writing Canadian mysteries and Canadians writing mysteries, which at first glance may seem like the same thing, but it's not. So I want to begin by introducing our panelists. I'm going to have each of them tell you a little bit about just who they are and what they write. We're going to begin with the panelist who wrote her first mystery story in grade 3. Welcome, Jayne Barnard.
Yes, grade 3. I was very fortunate to have a grade 3 teacher who let me take extra time and write what I wanted to write. Now, how often does that happen? I took a long hiatus because I was having children and careers and so on, but I started writing again in earnest back in 1990, and the first story I submitted anywhere won a Saskatchewan Writers Guild Award. I thought that was a really good sign. Here I am, 22 years later. I have won some more minor awards, all in short fiction. And last year, my first completed mystery novel placed in the top 3 in Canada for The Unhanged Arthur, which was also a big boost. Now, it's under consideration at a publisher, so that's all I'm going to say about that part of my career now. But I have lots to talk about because in all the years that I was writing short stories, I was also reading short stories, and I know a lot about all the really cool short stories written by Canadian authors who are mostly available in the dealer's room. And one of the things that has really marked my progress as a writer is that the mystery writers I know are very generous with their time and energy. And so later on, if we have time, I'm going to do a little show and tell of some of the stuff that they're writing that's really exciting that I want you to know about.
Thanks, Jayne. Our other panelist began his career when he was kicked out of grade 11 biology for talking too much, an accusation that he vehemently denies to this day. This is Stefan Legault.
Thanks, Anthony. Hi. It's really great to be here, and thank you all for coming to join us this afternoon. Mystery writing for me was a complete and utter accident. I always imagined myself writing great prosaic stories about landscape, both fiction and nonfiction. And a number of years ago, I was vacationing in Costa Rica, and it was incredibly wet. And we were sort of confined to our cabina for a decade, or for what seemed like a decade at least. And I had all this whole stack of mystery novels that you pick up from the roadside book swaps. And I was reading through them, and I started thinking that it was a very interesting genre, and I was quite attracted to some of the characters. And on the plane, on the way home, penned the outline for a series of stories and started trying to pitch them to publishers. And lo and behold, some years later, they got picked up by first New West and now Touchwood Editions. And so that's one of the series that I work on, the Cole Blackwater series. Like Jayne, who... bless her soul, is a ruthless promoter of fellow writers. I think one of the most amazing things that we can talk about when it comes to Canadian writing and Canadian authors is how quickly we self-promote and co-promote and promote one another throughout. So we'll be doing a little bit of that here today to help you find some books that you may not have heard of, that you should hear of, and hopefully we'll pick up and read.
Thanks, Stefan. My name is Anthony Bidulka, and I write the Russell Quant Mystery Series. So there's 8 books in the series thus far. The books they take place mainly in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is also my home city. And then in every one of the books, the detective travels to some foreign location during the course of his investigations. In the spring of 2013, I'm starting a new series featuring a fellow by the name of Adam Saint, and he's a Canadian disaster recovery agent. Those books are going to be also take place in part in Saskatoon, foreign locations, and a little bit in Toronto. Now, our plan today is that we're going to discuss some of the issues surrounding Canadian mysteries and Canadian mystery writers. And at the end, we're going to open it up for questions as well. So that is about your 40-minute warning to come up with some really tough questions for these two. But I want to begin by telling you about 2 events that made me think about some of these issues. The first is an article that appeared actually in the Calgary Herald. And the president of the Crime Writers of Canada was talking to this journalist, and he was telling him about a straw poll that had been done. And they went out onto the street, and they would grab a person and say, can you name 3 mystery authors from the United States? Everyone could do it. Can you name 3 mystery authors from the UK? Most people could do it. Can you name 3 mystery authors from Canada? Almost no one could do it. And then the president went on to say, but there are hundreds of Canadian mystery writers. Second event. This was compliments of my literary agent, and he was doing what all good literary agents should be doing. He was talking about me. And he was at some event and was having a conversation with quite a big U.S. publisher. And the publisher asked him this question that, when he recounted it to me, it really made me stop in my tracks. He said to my agent, he said, does your client want to be a Canadian writer, or does he want to be an international writer? And if he wants to be an international writer, he has to stop writing about Canada. Now, I think one of the things that's confusing this issue is that we have a lot of Canadian mystery writers who are writing about any place but Canada. And then let me reveal to you 2 more things. Of these 2 events, the article in the Calgary Herald happened 6 years ago, in 2006. That article went on to say that things were on the verge of changing in 2006. And it actually went on and listed by province what writers there were that were living and writing about their province. So, for instance, in Saskatchewan, it was myself and Gail Bowen. In Ontario, it was Rick Blechta. There, R.J. Harlick for Quebec. Right here in Calgary was John Ballum. The discussion between my agent and this publisher happened only 6 months ago. So my question is, what is the real story? And that's the truth that I'm going to try and squeeze out of these 2 this afternoon. So I want to begin by saying to Stefan and Jayne that I would call each of you a Canadian writer. And I'd like you to tell me whether you agree with me. And if you do you consider yourself a Canadian writer because of what you write or where you live? And if you don't agree with me, I don't want to hear about it. Jayne, do you want to start?
All right. I consider myself a Canadian writer, first, foremost, and always. When I was a child, I lived for a time in Europe, and that was one of those moments or events that changed my perception of what it means to be from a country. Canadians at that time had a really good reputation in Europe, and the American teenagers from the base used to come and steal our Canadian flags because they got better service if they were wearing a Canadian flag. That made me realize that I came from someplace special. And when I started looking at the history and complexity of Canadian society, I realized that we have everything the United States has, only we're nicer about it. So I am an unabashed Canadian supporter. Most of what I write involves Canadian history, Canadian culture, Canadian society, Canadian people, doing things in as uniquely Canadian way as I can.
So you're Canadian because you're Canadian.
Because
that's
I'm
where you
Canadian.
Live. All right, Stefan, what about you?
I wouldn't disagree with what Jayne said. I think that's a starting place for me as well. I'm proudly Canadian. One of my series is set during key historical events in Canada. First with the Canadian Pacific Railroad. My next book in that series is set during the Riel Rebellion. And part of the reason that I write those is because I'm so incredibly proud of Canada and its history, and sometimes a little ashamed that so few of us understand or know too much about it. That said, my approach to writing is part craft and part business. And I recognize that in order to even have a hope of making a living as a writer, my market has to include the places where people are and where people buy books. And the unfortunate reality is that there's, well, maybe it's actually a good thing. It's kind of what partly defines us, is that there isn't very many people in Canada. And there's a lot of people in Europe, and there's a lot of people in the United States. And so while I don't allow that to change my basic approach to the craft, it has, to a certain extent, helped me make decisions about where I set books. And though my approach to those things, I'm sure, is uniquely Canadian, as my editor would probably attest. I keep mixing up American and Canadian spellings all the time. For me, there's a certain Machiavellian nature that I think is required in order to, make bookselling a reality in a very, very difficult, very large marketplace right now.
So, Canadian because you live here, Canadian because that's what you write about?
Canadian because I live here, and Canadian because some of my books are about Canada, and some are definitely, set. Yeah. Like I have a series that I want to write at some point that's set in India.
Well, I think, I think I agree with the two of you. When I think of myself and my career, I would say I'm a Canadian writer just because I live in Canada. Mainly because it's one thing that I don't expect is going to change. I think I will always be Canadian. Will I always write about Canada? I never say never. If I were to ask this question of my readers, though, I don't know that they would necessarily agree with me. I think a lot of my readers, particularly my American readers, would say, you're a Canadian writer because that's what you write about. Would you two think the same? Like, would your readers, people who read your stuff, would they agree with what you just said?
I think my readers would. Yeah. But I think your readers would first and foremost agree that you have a really good taste in food.
Well, there's that too.
Never read Tony's books when hungry.
Or if you don't have a glass of wine with you.
Yes. We were actually kind of hoping that you were going to show up with something to drink.
Yeah, well, you never know. That's not water, Now, Jayne, you had mentioned the book that was shortlisted for the Crime Writers of Canada, which took place in Canada, but also partially in France, yes? Mm-hmm. And, Stefan, you have two series that are kind of, very much West Coast Canadian stories, mm-hmm. but the series that you're about to write is American Southwest.
Yep.
So I'm interested to hear about, you started it a bit, but what really drew you to wanting to write outside of Canada? And was there pressure to do so? Did you just do it for your own reasonings, or was there pressure being exerted either internally or externally to do that? Stefan, you want to talk about that?
So the two series that I have right now are yes, they're very much Canadian, although the Cole Blackwater series, which is the series that's set in modern day. The fourth book, which I'm working on right now, is set in part in the United States. Mm-hmm. I didn't have to stretch to make that happen. The character and the sort of overall narrative arc of the series naturally led the character into Montana. I spent a lot of time working my professional life. I spent about 3/4 of my time working in the States. And so it wasn't a stretch. The decision, however, to write the Red Rock Canyon series, the first book of which is called The Slick Rock Paradox, and will be out in September, that series is set in the American Southwest. For me, that was about 50%, the reasoning was about 50% sort of passion and about 50%, this is just a good place to set a mystery series from the perspective of wanting to sell books. The passion part is that, as I said earlier, I always imagined myself being a landscape narrative writer, and the mystery genre was just something that happened almost by accident. The American Southwest is a place that I feel incredibly passionate about. I've spent lots of time there. I used to work at Grand Canyon National Park as a ranger. I've climbed, hiked, paddled, mountain biked there for the last 15 years, and so it was natural to want to write about that landscape. My favorite author when I was growing up was Edward Abbey. He lived in the American Southwest and wrote about it, and so this series takes him in. But when I was really sort of mapping out my career, and I know this is going to sound really ridiculously type A, but I actually have a business plan for my writing about how I want to develop my writing career over the next 10 years. A part of it was, where can I set a book that I can easily write about, that I feel passionate about, but that will open my writing up to a much larger market? And so I chose the Southwest because that's a place that I know. There's a very rich literary tradition in the American Southwest. And frankly, maybe Anthony can relate to this. I want to write about a place that I want to travel to a lot. to give myself the excuse and the tax write-off. So I go down and ride my bike for 10 days, come back all bloody with a sheath of notes, and oh, that's a tax write-off. Awesome.
That's the way it's supposed to work.
Kind of 50-50 for me.
Well, that's partly why I set my book in southern France.
The dirty truth is coming out.
Yeah. No, actually, there is a little bit more to the story of why part of my book is set in France. And part of it is because I traveled in that area in the 70s, and it was beautiful. Has an amazing range of landscapes, some of which are quite like our Rocky Mountains. So when I came back to writing later, I just had to drive out towards Banff to really think about what the setting was going to be like for those portions. But also, not having a publisher for my novel yet, I'm under no pressure whatsoever about where I set my book. So there is a little bit more to the story of why part of it is set in France, and that has to do partly with having lived in Europe, and also partly to do with my understanding of latitude. We are above the 49th parallel, and one of my award-winning short stories was actually called The Medicine Line, which is the old name for the border between Canada and the U.S. And latitudinally and climate-wise, we have a lot more in common with Northern Europe and with Northern Asia than we do with, for example, Florida. Not that Florida's not nice, but we understand snow and cold and long winters, and the other thing that we have in common is that we have a large population that has moved laterally around the globe. So one of those moments in your life where I was driving between Calgary and Moose Jaw, where I was living at the time, and I picked up a young student from Quebec. University students from Quebec are all over the news now for their views. But back then, he was just a university student heading home from his summer job to get there in time for the fall semester, and we got to chatting as the night grew on about why he was still so determined that Quebec had to have a unique identity when it's been part of Canada for how many years. And he was very well informed about all the differences between Quebec law and custom that came from France 300 years ago and the Canadian society that we've built since then. And that got me thinking about the large portion of our population that still looks that way for a lot of their culture and tradition. And so some of my characters in that novel are French-Canadian by birth, but they have strong, strong ties to the motherland. And so that's partly why I set my book over there, was an acknowledgement of that cultural reality.
Yeah, interesting. I think in my experience, it's actually kind of a mixed bag. With my publisher, absolutely no pressure at all to write books set outside of Canada. Actually, quite the opposite. They're so focused on publishing authors who live and write about Canada that I think they might even be unhappy if I were to write something set in the United States. But everybody else, every agent, every editor, many readers, great deal of pressure to set my books in the United States in particular. And I think that in my career, I certainly don't think I set out to do it, but in a way I've kind of rebelled against that thinking, because to me that means that's saying there's no interesting stories to be told about Canada. And I think that's untrue. I mean, there's as many interesting characters right in this very room as in any room in any place in the United States. Now, that being said, at this point, I now have a long-running series based in Canada, starting another one. I would never say never, and Stephen is exactly right. It is a numbers game. I think the challenge for Canadian writers is that we have to find a way to jump those hurdles to be successful in the United States. There's 10 times the population in the U.S., which means there's 10 times the number of readers. And particularly when you're writing genre, as we do, and niche genre, as in particular I do, you need those numbers. I certainly find it a challenge when I'm touring or promoting in the United States. I have to work harder to make people believe that this is an interesting story. And so what if it happens in Saskatoon? You never heard of Saskatoon? Never been to Saskatoon? Who cares? Have you been to Helsinki? Probably not. It's the same thing. Now, there certainly have been a lot of Canadian writers who are writing about other places that have great success. So there's, Rick Mafina and Joy Fielding who are writing about the U.S. Peter Robinson, he's a Brit who's living in Toronto but writing about England. We're starting to see some superstars arising who are living in Canada and writing about Canada. Louise Penny is a real obvious one. She's, Quebec writer winning every award in every country you can think of. So I'm wondering from your perspectives, despite how you answered the first couple of questions, in the race, when it comes to sales and visibility and promotion and books on shelves, who is winning that race? Is it Canadians who are writing about Canada, or is it the Canadians who are still saying, I've got to write about the U.S. or otherwise? Stefan, you want to start?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define winning the race. If winning the race is about writing good stories and being happy doing it, then that's,
No, winning the race.
If we're
popularity, books on shelves.
Sure. So
who's winning?
I think it's pretty obvious that people like Linwood Barclay, for example, he made a decision 10, 15 years ago that he was going to set his thrillers in places like Connecticut and take advantage of one of the largest concentrations of book readers in the world. And Linwood sells, for some of his titles, sells easily 1 million copies, and he is clearly winning the race. And I don't think it's because his books are particularly superior to thrillers set in Canada or anywhere else. In fact, I think Linwood has a pretty good formula that he puts out that accomplishes what he wants to do. But by nature of the fact that it's set south of the border, I think it sells. I will say that I think one of the exceptions of that, there's actually two that I can think of. One is Giles Blunt, who's a brilliant writer who sets his books in a fictional town called Algonquin Bay, which is really about
North Bay,
it's
Ontario.
really North Bay, Ontario.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Northern Ontario, and I know North Bay, and it's not the place that people like in North Bay don't go to North Bay to have fun. So but the thing that he does that I think transcends that is his location could be anywhere. He doesn't dwell on the fact that it's Canada. He's not waving the flag. There's no there's no subtext of inferiority. He's simply chosen a setting, and it could be any place. It could be Minnesota. And the other person, and again, it's thin ice, but Chevy Stevens. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Chevy's work. She's a Nanaimo, BC-based writer. Her first book. What was her first book? Never mind. Look, Chevy writes about Vancouver Island. She writes psychological thrillers. Again, they could be just about anywhere. They happen largely inside of a person's mind, and that's the landscape that she's writing about. And so, her books could be set in Nanaimo, but they could also be set anywhere along the West Coast. So when it comes down to winning the race, I think people who are setting books either with an open setting that allows the reader to place that setting in their own landscape of imagination, or people who are setting their books in the U.S. or in Peter's case, the Europe and England are probably winning the numbers game.
Yeah. Jayne, what are your thoughts?
I think the race has only just begun. For many, many years, the only side was the people who wrote about elsewhere. And since Louise Penny hit the debut dagger a few years ago and then virtually spearheaded the Canadian Crime Writing Awards, Canadian crime writers are moving out from Canada, writing about Canada, and getting read elsewhere. And this is a huge, fundamental shift in our potential readership. I know some people get a bit disgruntled because Louise wins everything. You just have to breathe, and she's won another award. But the fact is, she has trailblazed for Canadian crime writers the way J.K. Rowling trailblazed for children's literature. She has changed the race.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. It's just she truly does win all the awards. And do I want those awards? Yes. But I really don't look at it as a competition. It's about profile. And, think of any other type of book that has incredible success, like the 50 Shades of Grey right now, or, any of the fantasy or thriller books that you can imagine that were really hot. But there's only so many books in a trilogy, right? There's 3. There's only so many shades of gray that they can write about. So what do people do? They that's true. But there's only 3 written thus far.
God, don't let there be 50 of them.
But what's the first people do? That, as soon as they're done those books, they start looking for other similar books. And the same thing happens with Louise Penny. All of a sudden, she's raising our profile. When they're done the latest Armand Gamache novel, they start looking, maybe Canadian mysteries aren't so bad. Who else is out there? So you're exactly right. That's a good point.
Just as a side note, my publisher and I were having a conversation the other day about which of my protagonists would look best tied up. And we just decided that it's just none of them would.
Indeed. Now, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add a little bit of Olympic reference, because I don't know if anybody else has had time to watch any of the Olympics, but there's a couple of Canadians in a couple of sports who have actively collaborated so that one of them would have a better chance of medaling. That they push the wind away from each other, they pace each other through the race to give one of them the best shot, and they have already decided what their strategy is going in. And I think that Canadian crime writers can get behind the Louise Pennys and the Tony, who's getting an international reputation in the past 5 years in amazing ways. We can get behind those writers and give them a push, because when they medal, when they win international awards and bring acclaim, they are bringing us along in their wake.
What do you think of that strategy, Tony?
I like that.
I thought you might.
Yeah. Now, sort of flipping this over a little bit, we can all think about writers who are writing about their home countries and having fantastic success. Probably the most obvious example is Agatha Christie and all her myriad of mystery novels set in England. More recent is the Swedish writers, Henning Mankell, Stieg Larsson, and they are having success around the world, and not just a little bit of success, but major success. My friend and colleague in Saskatchewan, Gail Bowen, who writes the Saskatchewan Mystery Series, she loves telling this story about interviewing an author who was told that Canada is foreign without being interesting. So what do you two think about that?
I think we watch too much television from America. We have. One of my studies for many years was Prohibition history. And Canada has a Prohibition history. Canada has a very complex Prohibition history because it was never a nationwide initiative the way it was in the States. Some of the provinces had varying forms of Prohibition, and some of them had none and made fortunes selling across the provincial lines and so on. We did not have 24-car gangster funerals in Canada during Prohibition the way Chicago did, but we had direct rail links with express trains running between Chicago and Moose Jaw and Winnipeg, supplying booze south during American Prohibition, and that meant that we had a lot of business people dealing with the Capones and other gangs. But because we have 1/10 of the population, and we're, fairly non-confrontational as a nation, the only known Prohibition murder in all of Canadian Prohibition was in a town in Saskatchewan so small it barely exists. Its original name was French, Bienfait, but of course it's been anglicized to Beanfait. And on a railway siding outside the town at midnight, some enterprising man from Regina was selling a boxcar of booze to some enterprising Americans. And they didn't bring the money. They got into an argument, and there was a shotgun fired, and the Americans took off with the booze and left the Canadian dead. And that was the only Canadian Prohibition murder. Does that mean that we didn't have a fascinating history with fascinating characters who made fortunes overnight? The Bronfman family, Seagram's whiskey fame, got their start during Prohibition. We had Canadian war stories, we have Canadian adventure stories, we have great Canadians who have climbed Everest and gone to the moon and done amazing things, and we can celebrate those people without expecting them to be like American TV heroes. Sorry, my little rant.
Yeah, no, that's
a
great.
good rant.
Good. Yeah, that's good. Stefan?
So the fact that I take the history of the Canadian Pacific Railroad and set a gunfight on the shore of Lake Louise might not really go over all that well with Jayne.
Well, I did read that scene, Stephen, and I did raise my eyebrows, but then I thought, no, in a camp, could have happened.
Could have happened. So I think that because we have a very narrow interpretation or picture of our own history, there's a lot of very and incredibly interesting things that have happened in Canada that are fodder for stories. And, just the little slice that I deal with, which is sort of the 1885 through the turn of the century, I just spent the last couple of years working on a book set during the Riel Rebellion, the Resistance. And, anybody that doesn't think that Canada had an incredibly interesting slice of military history right on its own soil should delve into the history of that story. It's incredibly fascinating. There was plenty of bloodshed, plenty of intrigue, lots of fodder there, and as a mystery writer, I get to take the true story and get to know it as well as I possibly can, and then distort the hell out of it in order to create something fun and interesting that will allow the reader to hopefully ask their own questions. And Mark Twain said that you first get your facts straight and then distort them all you like. And so that's the approach that I take to writing historical mysteries. And if at the end of reading The End of the Line or The Third Rail Conspiracy, people want to go out and find out what the real story is behind the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway through the Rockies, or the history of the rebellion, or the next book, which will be set during the Great Fire in Vancouver in 1886, that would be really great.
Well, I think that's a good point, because I think there's no doubt that there's amazing, interesting stories out there to be told. I wonder if it's about how they have been told. Like, thank goodness we have writers like you who are, the two of you are creating interesting, fun, quirky stories. But I wonder if we have a bit of a history that is why the perception is there. There are so many books out there that are cold and dark and talking about the Depression and, we're a new country, so there's a lot of tough immigrant stories. Even when I think about, Canadian TV and documentaries, they always look dark and grainy to me. And that's people's perception. Like, where are the stories that are bright and frolicking on beaches and having lots of sex and drinking too much? That's, I think, what's got to... that's what I'm writing, yeah. So I think we have to take some responsibility for it, and I think we've got this, crop of new writers who are starting to do that. I think the perception of Canadian novels in, even 5-10 years is going to really change. Both of you have some experience in writing Canadian locales, and obviously I think there's some perception about what a Canadian mystery is when you talk to people in the United States. But do you think there is such a thing as a Canadian genre mystery? And if so, what is it? What makes it so? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it just because you talk about snow? What makes a Canadian genre mystery? What is it, Jayne? What is it?
Okay, well, I would have to go with the no, there isn't one side.
Okay.
I think that there are a lot of great stories set in Canada and about Canadians, but we have a huge country and we have amazing regional differences that we don't celebrate enough. Frankly, there's some great mysteries coming out of Newfoundland now, some military histories by Tom Curran, right? Mm-hmm. And he's dealing with parts of the country that I never thought much about. He's dealing with parts of our military history that I never thought much about. He's dealing with the whole quirky Newfoundland culture that my biggest acquaintance with is actually got booze in it, Anthony. So we're not
excellent.
And then all the way across the country, there are people writing about their part of Canada and their quirky people and their, small, weird ways of doing things. Because although we have coasts on the east and west, the people on the West Coast are not the same as the people on the East Coast. Although the booze tends to, be good. There's more pot on the West Coast.
But are both of those people very Canadian still, as opposed to being
See,
American?
I'm not 100% sure.
No? Okay.
I think Canadian is more of the invisible flag that's flying over all our heads, but we can celebrate our differences and still be Canadian. Mm-hmm. And that just as much in fiction as in real life.
Yeah. Stefan, what's your take?
This question is perplexing, and I actually spent some time thinking about it, which was strange.
You were supposed to think about this panel.
My wife read the questions to me on the drive-in this afternoon. To define a Canadian genre of mysteries, I think is really difficult. I think we want it to be about landscape, we want it to be about setting, we want it to be about place, and yet, as somebody who reads just as many or maybe even more American series, most of the series that I'm drawn to in the States are also about those things. Now, not all of them, but many of them are. Right now I'm reading C.J. Box, and his books are all set in Wyoming and Montana, a piece of country that I know really well, and I love reading them. Mm-hmm. So I can't really say that. Part of me also wants to think that a lot of the mysteries that I read about Canada feature amateur sleuths, and that could help define Canadian mysteries a little, but then I think, well, no, Louise Penny's guy is he's an inspector, he's with the police force, and same with Giles's series, so that doesn't really do it. I think that the thing that defines Canadian mysteries right now is that as a genre and as a business, we're in our infancy, and so if anything, what's defining us is the latent potential that is sitting within that, those writers and the publishing houses that are struggling to push those books out into the world. It's not something that you can read on the book. It's something that exists as part of the industry right now.
Mm-hmm. Do you two think that you need to live in a place to write well about it? I'm going to guess you're going to say no, but I mean, the places you write about, you've been, you love, you have passion for, and actually you too. So do you think you need to spend lots of time there to write it well? I think
you need to spend some time there to write it well. Your question when, in this story was, or is a good Google search enough? Absolutely not. I remember being on a panel once with somebody who read this section of their book, and then later confessed to me that they'd actually never been to the place, nor had they ever experienced what they were writing about. And I felt let down. And for me, the rule is that if you're going to write about any place, you've got to go there. Now, that's not to say that I don't use the internet to help fill in the pieces. For example, a book that I recently published called The Vanishing Track, which is set in the downtown east side of Vancouver. I spent a lot of time traipsing the streets and alleys of the downtown east side of Vancouver, both professionally and then just, as a writer. Did I use Google to go back and use Street View to figure out, was there a light post in that alley where my character gets mugged? Yes, there is. So there's a good chance that he could get his head banged against it. Good. But you've got to put some time in. You don't have to live there, but you've got to know what it smells like, what it feels like under the feet. You've got to know if you stand a fair chance of getting your hand cut if you run it along a particular surface.
Jane, do you agree?
Well, can I do some promos?
Not quite
this
yet.
is sort of related to your question, because I have sitting here new book by a new Canadian crime writer, Peggy Blair. It's called The Beggar's Opera. It's actually set in Havana, which she really loves. And she's been there a lot, and she tastes it and smells it, and you taste it and smell it. And I think that's a very powerful argument for actually writing about places you've been, because you can immerse your reader in all kinds of sensory details that are not available on Google. This is also a police procedural involving a Canadian cop accused of a crime in Cuba, so it's a great cultural insight. And because Peggy, in her paying job, did a lot of work with international judicial committees, she understands the complexities of dealing with other people's justice systems when you have a Canadian in trouble abroad. And so we get, with this one package, because she fell in love with Cuba, we get in this one book an amazing immersion into the culture, into the place, into the society, and to look back at our own culture and how it reflects out. So not only is this a really gripping, very suspenseful book, but it's a good cultural education.
I'm maybe going to just stop you there. We've got to see if there's any questions. If there's any questions about Canadian writers or just the process of writing in Canada. Yes?
I had to come late because I had a pitch session, but so you might have mentioned it at the beginning, but is the RCMP up for grabs? Can you write the RCMP without, is that sort of public domain?
Without worrying about getting tasered?
I hope so, because I do
Speaking
it all
from
the time.
experience there, Stefan?
Yeah, of course. They're absolutely up for grabs. And in fact, the RCMP has, in Ottawa, they have a public relations unit that deals with authors that you can call up and ask questions of and get feedback on. And over the years, I've had relationships with different public relations constables or corporals in different detachments to. Yeah, they're up for grabs, and historically, they're totally up for grabs.
Yeah, pretty much any police enforcement organization in any city or town, they're usually pretty happy to talk to you, and because it's in their best interest that you get it right.
Yeah.
Well, I had my book vetted by my husband's cousin, who was an RCMP sergeant for years and years, so he's gone through and told me all the things I did wrong.
Yeah, well, that's perfect.
Really helpful.
Yeah, that's exactly what you have to do. There's a question in the back, sir.
Calgary is probably the most multicultural city in Canada, and I have yet to find very many books anywhere, let alone in Canadian, that deal with the multicultural aspect of our communities and the changing of our communities. Is that an issue?
Interesting. So the comment is about how multicultural Calgary is, and really Canada is, and that there aren't a lot of books reflecting that. And just wondering if that's an issue. Either of you have a comment on that?
That is a good question, and I would have to say that my grazing through the Canadian mystery scene shows that we really do hit on a lot of cultural diversity. The Water Rat of Wanchai, Ian Hamilton, takes a Chinese-Canadian girl born here. Her family is really traditionally Chinese, but she has learned to navigate in this environment and make a successful business for herself. And she's really straddling two worlds, and you really get a sense of that. And that's only one example off the top of my head, but yeah, I think that Canadian mystery does a way better job than a lot of people realize of examining the complexities of our society in culturally, socially, and just about any other issue you want to name.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about hometown support for Canadian writers. I've been down in Bisbee, Arizona, and every store there is selling a J.A. Jans. So what's it like for Canadian writers?
Yeah, so the question is about hometown support of Canadian writers. Stefan, do you want to start us out on that?
I think that there's great hometown support. I mean, I live in Canmore, Alberta, and our bookstore, ruthlessly promotes my stuff. I think it's great, and I absolutely adore them. And here in Calgary too, the Owl's Nest, who've got a table set up here, are incredible supporters of local writers, and as is Pages on Kensington. I think they do a great job. Again, there's only so big a market, and that makes it a little bit challenging for them to push the books out. But my experience has been very, very, very positive.
Yeah, as has been mine. I live in Saskatoon, and with each of my books, my very first launch is always in Saskatoon, and hundreds of people show up every year. The bookstore that I have it in is called McNally Robinson, which you'll be familiar with. Because my books are always set in a different exotic location, they create a menu of food reflecting that location. There is a menu of drinks reflecting that location. So this last book was Dos Equis, set in Mexico. It was like having a Mexican party for hundreds of my best friends and family. They really go over the top.
If you're ever in Saskatoon for one of Tony's book launches, I've only seen the pictures, although I'm so going someday. These look like incredible parties.
Yes.
Yeah, no, they're great.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the stories are legend.
Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Are Canadian publishers doing much to promote Canadian books internationally?
Good question. So the question is, are Canadian publishers doing a lot to promote Canadian books in international markets. Any opinions?
I think they are. My publisher, Touchwood Editions, which is part of Heritage House, has a foreign rights agent that's schlepping my stuff around Europe. We haven't had any major bites yet, but they're trying. I think that the experience with the bigger presses right now is that it's about volume, and so the bigger presses have simply more opportunities to have foreign rights agents moving stuff around in other presses in other markets. But they're trying very, very hard because they, I think, like the rest of us, recognize that in order to have our books sell well, they need to tap into big markets.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they are trying pretty hard to do that. As I was saying earlier, we as the authors have to pitch in. I see us as a team. I don't see once I have send my book to my publisher, I don't think that's it. I'm going to help, and I want to know what you're doing, and I want to know what I can do to help. So when a book comes out, we start strategizing on how are we going to promote this in markets other than my hometown, And, in the early days of my career, there were times where I went on small tours in the United States, and I put some of my money into those tours because I knew my publisher didn't have a leg to stand on. I was a nobody author from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, who no one had heard of. I needed to put some of my money where my mouth was. And it helped. It really made a difference. But I think there are many different things you can do. A lot of them don't cost money. But you have to be prepared to be innovative and be part of the team, I think, is the key. Yes?
Film rights. I'm just wondering how much success Canadian writers are having in the mystery field and selling film rights.
Mm-hmm.
I know that both Linwood Barclay and Chevy Stevens' books have been optioned of late. So is one of Giles Blunt's books have been optioned for. He's got an option for television. I think that it's mixed success. And unfortunately, a lot of the times when you see the screen adaptation, the book has been set in the States rather than in Canada.
So my series has been under option probably since book 3, and to me, it's kind of exciting because I know nothing about the film industry, but the development company that has the books under option, they're in Toronto. They're very dedicated to, if they find a production company who's interested, to shoot it in Saskatchewan. For those of you who were at the keynotes last night, I talked about how Saskatchewan just got rid of their Saskatchewan film tax credit. So I am worried I'm going to lose my option. But I think there are a number of us who do have those options out there. How many actually make it to made-for-TV movies or TV series, I think, is probably pretty small. But as I said last night, I derive a very good income from having my books under option. It's a very powerful thing for authors, and I think there's a lot of them out there. My friend Gail Bowen, who writes her series in Saskatchewan, exactly what Stefan was talking about. They optioned hers. They actually did make them into movies of the week. Her books are set in Regina. The movies of the week are set in Toronto. And I always remember asking her, I said, so do you feel bad, that they didn't keep them in Regina? And she said, well, I do until I step into my brand new kitchen. So we have time for one more question. Anyone? No? All right. Well, I want to thank my panelists for their involvement and their good comments, and thank all of you for being here and your attention.